Hi there! In this screencast, we're going to take a look at what's new in ReSharper Ultimate, and we're going to look at the new features available in ReSharper, ReSharper C++, .cover, .trace, .memory, and .peek as well. Let's start by looking at some of the new parts available in ReSharper itself. When it comes to string interpolation, ReSharper supports lots of options. For example, here you can change from string interpolation into using string.format. In this particular example, you can change concatenation into string interpolation. In this example, what you can do is you can take a chunk of the string, and if you use a refactoring for introducing a variable, then what will happen is we'll take that into account and actually interpolate this particular string. And finally, if you have string interpolation inside string interpolation, then ReSharper will help you inline the nested interpolations. And ReSharper also provides support for turning strings into link objects. So for example, if you're using nouveautés of JSON and you've got a JSON definition in a string, what you can do is you can press Alt-Enter and choose to link to JSON, and that turns it into an object definition. And the same works for link to XML. So if you've got a chunk of XML, you can press Alt-Enter and you can simply turn it into the appropriate XML definitions. Another group of context actions that ReSharper supports are actions which generate checks upon method parameters based on their type. And we have some new things here. For example, for string parameters, ReSharper now helps generate checks not only for null, but you can also check a string against an empty string or indeed a white space string. For numeric parameters such as int, double, or decimal, ReSharper can write a check that ensures that only non-negative numbers are actually passed. For enum parameters, ReSharper can generate a check to make sure that an enum value being passed is in fact defined with the appropriate enum declaration. This helps you guard against incorrect casts. And finally, for a collection of parameters, ReSharper helps you check against empty collections. Here are just a few more context actions that are available. First of all, ReSharper is now very flexible in its treatment of attributes. So if you've got attributes and you want to keep them on a single line, then you can do exactly that, having them in a single section. Or if you want to split them by line, once again, we have a context action for doing exactly that. You'll notice that we've downgraded the severity of the inspection, which offers to turn a for each or for statement into a link statement from a suggestion to a hint. When it comes to commenting and uncommenting code, it's now possible to simply select the code, press Alt-Enter, and we provide an action to uncomment. And another feature is that if you've got a class, not only can you make a derived type, but you can also make another part of the type by turning it into a partial class and placing the other part in some other location. ReSharper comes with context actions which are specific for the support for Windows Communication Foundation. Here are a few examples. For example, here we have a one-way operations contract which happens to return a value. So ReSharper picks up on it and you can press Alt-Enter and change the return type to void, or alternatively make the operation two-way. Similarly, here we have a contract which doesn't actually have any operations contract, and you can press Alt-Enter and choose to add operation contract to all methods of this particular interface. Here is a similar situation. We have an operations contract but no service contract, so you can press Alt-Enter and you can either add a service contract attribute to the interface, or alternatively you can remove the operations contract from the method. Here we have a similar situation. We have a type which is a data contract, but none of its members are decorated with a data member attribute. So once again, you can press Alt-Enter and you can annotate all the public fields with the data member attribute. And here is a similar situation, but we have an enumeration. And once again, you can press Alt-Enter and you can annotate every enum member with the enum member attribute. ReSharper's Smart Paste functionality has received additional improvements. For example, if I take a chunk of code like the one up above and I paste it into the example, I get a pop-up to escape the pasted text, and if I press Alt-Enter, you'll notice that all the HTML incompatible symbols are now escaped with the appropriate literals. Now let's say I have this chunk of code and I want to paste it into a string. So I can write, for example, var s equals, put the double quotes and press Ctrl V. Once again, I get a pop-up for escaping the pasted text, and here it's escaped according to C# rules. Similarly, If I make a verbatim string, for example, and put the double quotes and I press paste, then I can press Alt Enter, and here we get a lot less escaping because we simply escape the double quotes, but the line breaks are part of the verbatim construct. If I decide to paste a chunk of XML, then once again I can put in the double quotes, I can Control V my text, and I can press Alt Enter to perform the appropriate escapements. And similarly, if I'm pasting a path, for example, I can simply Control V the Windows path, press Alt Enter, and my backslashes once again escape. One new refactoring that's making its appearance in ReSharper is the Invert Boolean refactoring, and this is useful when you have a true or false returning function or property which you want to invert, and you also want to invert their usages. So for example, I have a Boolean property called available, and I can invoke the Invert Boolean refactoring and change its name to not available. Now I have options for inverting the values inside the member, turning true to false, and also inverting the usages of a member. So after I execute this refactoring, you'll see that the true has turned to false, but in addition, the usage of the refactoring now has a negation operator in front of it, preserving the correctness of the program. The optimized reference functionality in ReSharper now handles NuGet packages as well, so if you go into optimized references, not only will you see assemblies, but you also see entire NuGet packages. And similarly, if you go into remove unused references, then once again ReSharper shows you the NuGet packages which aren't being used, and you can remove them. In this release of ReSharper, we have restored a dedicated action for reformatting code. You can invoke it with a shortcut. You can also invoke it just by pressing Alt Enter on a selection, for example, and in addition you can invoke it on the entire file, for example by going through the menu, choosing Edit, and then Reformat Code. Or once again you can invoke the shortcut, and this also works if you are in the Solution Explorer, in which case it will reformat every file that you've selected. There are two new features to further extend the level of detail of your code styles, and as usual with code styles, the new features are configurable and are applied as part of code cleanup. So the first feature is if you consider the following method call, so we're calling add checkbox with true, some string, and a null. When you read this code, you have to stop and examine the method signature to actually understand what's happening here, but with named arguments, this call can become much clearer. Now, if you prefer to have named arguments for your specific types, you can do so with a little help from ReSharper. So in the settings, you can define which kinds of arguments you actually want named arguments for as opposed to positional arguments. So for example, we can choose named arguments for strings and also for other data types here. And after I save this, you'll see that we have an option here of pressing Alt Enter and adding the missing argument, and it's also a fixed in scope action, so I can add every argument in this particular file. And of course, even if you don't have any style preferences for arguments, you can always just navigate to the invocation, press Alt Enter, and add the argument name anyway. Now, the C# specification allows you to safely omit braces around single nested statements, like for example this throw statement here. However, code style guidelines may differ in this regard, and some consider that braces here are a requirement and some consider them redundant. So whatever style you prefer, ReSharper now helps you have consistent use of braces throughout your codebase. Preferences for each kind of block can be configured separately in ReSharper settings. And you can also specify what kind of notification you get if you don't follow the guidelines. So here I can move an if, press Alt Enter, and add the missing braces. This release of ReSharper comes with improved highlighting ranges for errors involving complex types, and previous versions of ReSharper would highlight essentially the entire statement containing an error, which would hinder locating where the error was actually coming from, especially for complex generic types. But from now on, ReSharper highlights only the part of the type which is erroneous, and offers ways of actually fixing the problem. For a very long time, ReSharper only supported the NUnit framework, but now we're shipping support for the XUnit framework as well, and you can expect similar functionality. So you have ReSharper correctly identifying your facts and your theories in XUnit, you have the appropriate icons for actually running or debugging or covering or profiling the tests. You have external annotations which ensure that ReSharper doesn't flag your tests as unused code. And finally, you have the test runner itself with the typical controls and functionality. Finally, for those of you using visualbasic.net, we've now provided support for Visual Basic 14. So the kind of things that ReSharper now supports and understands are things like, for example, the name of operator, read-only automatic properties, the type of is not notation, string interpolation, year first date literals, and many other improvements that have appeared in Visual Basic 14. This release of ReSharper provides comprehensive support for the JSON format, so you get things like code completion based on the schema that you're working in. You get typing assistance. You also get validation. So for example, if I define a bunch of files and then I put something else in here, I get a quick fix to fix the actual value type. In addition to the various forms of validation that we provide, we also provide you the file structure window. This window helps you figure out the structure of your JSON file, and of course you can double-click any of the nodes to navigate to the appropriate elements. This release of ReSharper provides comprehensive support for TypeScript 1.7 and 1.8, so you get support for things like exponentiation, polymorphic this-based type guards, augmentation. You also get support for string literal types with inspections, of course. So for example, this assignment is invalid and ReSharper picks it up as such. And you also get support for things like the use of type parameters as constraints, what's called f-bounded polymorphism. So we provide support for it and also provide inspections to make sure you don't make any mistakes. We've also made improvements to the JSDoc support that we've had for quite some time. So for example, here we're specifying that a function takes an object of type person, and we're providing the typical features for this person. So for example, if you're slicing a string, you might have person dot and you get code completion for this person. You can also have HTML embedded in JSDoc now, and ReSharper will render it correctly. So for example, if you use the quick documentation, you will get a nicely formatted layout, including boldface text and links and monospaced code as well. And finally, ReSharper is now able to resolve even generic types inside comments. So for example, here we have a function which can take a tier, return a T array. So if I call it with a type of object, I know that it's returning an array of those objects. I can get one of them, and after I put a dot, ReSharper's code completion actually shows me the elements for this particular object. The formatting settings for JavaScript and TypeScript became a lot more granular with this release. So now you can specify, for example, the right margin for your code and define whether and how various code constructs should be wrapped. So for example, you can specify whether to place dots on a multi-line chain method call, or you can opt in for a comma-first approach for argument lists, object literals, and function calls. We like to push the boundaries a little bit, so this release of ReSharper comes with support for some of the experimental JavaScript features, such as, for example, comprehensions. There are actually two types of comprehensions. There are the square bracket ones, which make arrays, and the round bracket ones, which make iterators. We provide some support for the async await paradigm, also the exponentiation operator. We provide support for the rest spread in object literals and object destructuring, the double colon bind operator, decorators, properties inside classes, call constructors, and deletion in functions. So these trailing commas don't really count for anything. This release of ReSharper comes with initial support for Node.js, so you get the typical ReSharper goodies that you're well familiar with, like for example code completion, you get code inspections, quick fixes, you get navigation features, and we're looking forward to your feedback regarding the use of Node.js. Another thing that we've added is that ReSharper now correctly handles TypeScript modules installed via npm, which is something that's crucial for Angular development. Let's take a look at some of the new features available in this release of ReSharper C++. ReSharper C++ comes with a new feature called the To-Do Explorer. Now, the To-Do Explorer is a separate tool window, and what it does is it locates comments in your code which contain specific keywords, such as to-do or bug, for example, and it lists them in an easy-to-use menu where you can double-click any of the items to navigate to the particular line where this comment is present. Now, this window is highly customizable. You can filter the types of comments that you want to see. You can also group them. So, for example, I can group by file and see the actual files that different comments are in. And of course, in addition to the predefined to-do and bug comments, it is possible to define your own patterns or customize existing ones. In most cases, when there is a code inspection, you get one or more quick fixes, which should be available to actually fix the detected problem. And with that in mind, this release of ReSharper C++ adds additional quick fixes to some of the existing code inspections. So here are a few examples. For example, here, when we have a constructor parameter, we now have a quick fix for creating and initializing the corresponding field. Whenever ReSharper detects possible unintended object slicing, it now offers you a quick fix to add a static cast. If the type of a value that's being returned from a function does not match the actual return type, then you get a quick fix to actually change the return type of the function to the correct one. If you're attempting to assign a read-only member, then ReSharper now offers you a quick fix to make the data member mutable. If a base class or its function has a final modifier, then ReSharper will highlight the error over both the final keyword as well as any overriding classes, and once again offer you a quick fix to make the base class non-final. And there are additional fixes too. For example, the rename refactoring now works on files, so you can invoke it like so, change the file name, press next, and this will rename the file as well as any usage of this file. It's also worth noting that the rename behavior also applies when renaming just the classes. So here I have a class apple defined in apple.h and apple.cpp, and if I change this apple to an orange, for example, what you'll see is not just the symbol being renamed in the header and CPP, but also the include as well as the names of the files themselves. There are also improvements in the code generation functionality. For example, if I were to generate the relational operators for this particular class, I also have an option of using std_tie, and this is reflected in the code that's generated. And there are a few more changes. So first of all, the list of supported C++ language features has been extended with things like generalized lambda captures and exception specifications. We also have formatting options now being taken into account when you're generating code. And finally, all ReSharper C++ actions are now actually banned from changing any of your library headers. And finally, this release of ReSharper C++ provides support for the Boost Test framework, providing similar functionality to what we already have for Google Test. Let's talk about some of the new things in this release of .cover. So first of all, .cover now speeds up the test execution and continuous testing scenarios for MS test and XUnit tests by preloading the test runners, and this is something that was previously only available for NUnit tests. Another improvement applies to the relationship between .cover, console runner, and TeamCity. So TeamCity is now tuned to understand the output of the console runner and can highlight its errors and warnings in the build log. And another feature is that the search results are now highlighted right in the coverage tree. Another new feature that we've added is, given a test that's failing, you can actually press the Show Stack Trace button to open the Stack Trace Explorer from which you can navigate the stack trace. And finally, it's worth mentioning that coverage filters are now supported in a continuous testing session. Let's take a look at some of the new features available in this release of .trace. Prior to this release of .trace, the main drawback of the integrated viewer compared to its standalone counterpart was the absence of the threads diagram, and this update actually removes the drawback. We've got the integrated viewer exactly as the same diagram, and you can now use it to select threads, you can select specific time ranges, and of course for each of the selections you get to see what was actually called. The .trace console utilities have also got their share of improvements, so now the reporter.exe tool that's packaged as part of .trace, which is used to get the performance data from snapshots, it now puts additional data in its XML reports, and if you build it with the add process info switch, then the report will actually include a path to the executable of the process that was profiled, and this can be extremely helpful when profiling applications with multiple child processes. Let's take a look at some of the improvements available in this release of .memory. All your navigation history through .memory profiling results is now recorded, and you can quickly return to any view or diagram by pressing the browser style backwards and forwards buttons. We've also made improvements to .memory unit, which is our memory unit testing framework. So now object selection queries support open generic types, useful if you want to find out all the substitutions to your generic type. You can also select objects using wildcards such as like and not like, and these queries work on types, interfaces, and namespaces as well. You also get improved performance of key queries such as type is or interface is, and finally test that execute queries from child processes are now handled correctly. Let's take a look at some of the new features in .peak. This release of .peak supports the correct rendering of extension methods. As you can see here, sort by, skip, and take are actually extension methods, and they're rendered correctly instead of being rendered as static method calls. For a long time, the only way to open NuGet packages in .peak was to open the actual package file from disk, but now we provide additional options. So you can go into File and you can open a package directly from NuGet. So simply type in the name, select the version, and press Open. And the other way is to open a packages.config file from a project that you already have. And another useful feature is that .peak now highlights the usages of the symbol under the caret, and this is something that can be useful particularly if you're working with obfuscated code. So that's it. Thank you for checking out the screencast, and to find out more about ReSharper, go to jetbrains.com/ReSharper. Thanks for watching.